Former NBC investigative producer Bob Windrem reports in the Daily Beast that Vice President Cheney's office suggested waterboarding an Iraqi prisoner suspected of knowing about a relationship between al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein. In other words, to bolster the case for war in Iraq. Bob Windrem joins us right now, along with Newsweek investigative reporter and MSNBC contributor Mike Isikoff, whose book Hubris is out in paperback. He co-authored that book with David Corn. Let's go, Bob, with this story. What do you have to report about this role taken by the Vice President's office in the interrogation of that Iraqi prisoner?
Well, in April of 2003, Chris, one of the highest-ranking secret police officers in Saddam's security apparatus was arrested by the U.S., and there were interrogations that began almost immediately. He was believed to have information both on WMD, specifically chemical weapons, and any nexus between the regime and terrorism. And as the interrogation moved on and reports were sent back to Washington to the Vice President's office, someone in the Vice President's office, according to Charles Dulfer, who wrote this in his book, or at least he wrote that someone high up in Washington, suggested that the interrogations were too gentle, and in fact suggested as well that enhanced interrogation techniques, particularly waterboarding, be used against this official. Now, Dulfer disagreed with this, and also the CIA back in Washington disagreed, because they said the legal opinions that we all know about now only covered high-value detainees involved in al-Qaeda. And so there was no waterboarding. But it goes to the issue that at this point in time, and this is after the war has begun and the mission accomplished has taken place, the Vice President's office continually had an interest in the fine details of the interrogations that were going on in Iraq, among other places, as we now know.
So in addition to doing a lot of effort to go over to the to Langley, to the CIA before the war in Iraq, to try to make the case for war with Iraq, they now, after having gotten us into the war in Iraq, and this is the Vice President's office, the Vice President's office pushed to get proof that it was justified to go into Iraq.
Right, and what we're seeing at this point, according to intelligence officials I spoke to, was a great deal of interest in any one of a number of issues related to the war in Iraq, related to al-Qaeda attacks. I mean, one of the things I was told, for example, was that the Vice President's office wanted to know everything that could be gleaned about the possibility of Mohammed Atta meeting an Iraqi intelligence official in Prague, a meeting that we now know never took place and has long been discredited. But these are the sorts of things that they were interested in. They were interested in that nexus. They were interested as well in WMD, because at this point in time as well, the WMD search is now starting to falter. So a lot of pressure was on them to move forward and to get answers on things that they had already used to justify the war.
Is this why, Mike Isikoff, the Vice President, is so scared of all this talk about investigating who approved the torture? Here's the Vice President. He was obsessed with this Prague meeting. He's obsessed, as you know, with trying to prove that we went to war with Iraq because Iraq had something to do with attacking us on 9/11. Never able to prove it. Obsessed with this WMD, but mainly obsessed with getting us to go with a war with Iraq. And then after we got in there, could find no WMD, obsessed with this big fight with the CIA to prove that we went in there justifiably. It has, to me, the fingerprints, or let's put it this way, the MO of the Vice President himself. Right. He was the one most obsessed with this Prague connection.
Look,
right or wrong?
Of course you're right. There's a striking, almost eerie parallel in the story of the use of these enhanced aggressive interrogation techniques, waterboarding, and the run-up to the war in Iraq. It is in August of 2002 when the waterboarding of Abu Zubaydah begins, with a strong push from the Vice President's office. That is precisely the time that the Bush administration is preparing to launch its case for the invasion of Iraq. Remember, it is right after Labor Day. We don't start it until they don't start it until right after Labor Day. They begin the push for the Congressional War Resolution, which is in October. Abu Zubaydah, the guy who was the first candidate for waterboarding, worked as part of the Qaeda training camp in Afghanistan. The emir of the Qaeda training camp was Ibn Sheikh al-Libi, who was just in the news this week because he ended up dead in a Libyan prison cell. It was Ibn Sheikh al-Libi who, after being rendered to the Egyptians, provided the bogus intelligence about Saddam Hussein training al-Qaeda operatives in chemical and biological weapons, a claim that was later cited by President Bush in his speech in Cincinnati in October 2002 and Secretary Powell in his presentation to the United Nations. Ibn Sheikh al-Libi, after he comes back into the U.S. custody, recants that entire story, said he only told it
so we get him to say what we want him to say so that we can go into a war we wanted to go into with no real evidence.
Right. So, you know, you have, and here you have the guy who worked with Ibn Sheikh al-Libi who was being waterboarded right at that same time. It's a reasonable question. I can tell you Senate investigators and others want to look at this. Was the purpose behind the waterboarding, or one purpose, to confirm the bogus claim by Ibn Sheikh al-Libi and help justify the war?
It seems to me, Bob Windrem, I know you're a reporter and have opinions on this, but you do study this, that this suggests that a commission, were it to take place, would open up all these doors, not just to who ordered the torturing and whether it was justified or not by the circumstances, which were obviously dire, but whether the torture was in fact inflicted on people to make a political case for a war that had yet been decided upon, according to all the arguments of this president and his people. I'm talking about Bush and Cheney. They said they decided on the war based on the evidence. Well, it turns to me that we're now seeing that they produced some of the evidence through torture.
Well, certainly, Chris, there is a ton of paper out there that we have not seen. I mean, what we have seen is a very limited view of what was going on at that point. We have not seen the interrogation logs, which lay out what actually happened in those interrogation rooms. We have not seen the interrogation reports. We do not know what intelligence was produced by which particular enhanced interrogation technique. I mean, we know very little. And if there is a Truth and Reconciliation Commission or something called that, or called like that, you are going to see that commission, as every commission we have ever seen exist, is going to go further and further and further into this issue and going to be demanding more and more and more. And ultimately what you're going to see is a lot of people, not just in the White House, not just in the CIA, but in Congress, having had some enabling role in all of this.
Right. Well, let me ask you about the Vice President's office. The Vice President of the United States, I go back to this, has no constitutional executive authority. He's simply there to replace the President should he have to and to preside over the Senate. How did this Vice President get operational control of the CIA?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, certainly he is somebody who had roles in the Bush 1 and in the Ford administration, where he certainly had national security roles, very significant national security roles as Chief of Staff in the Ford administration and also as Secretary of Defense. And I think essentially there was a devolvement of power within the White House that led the Bush Oval Office team to grant some of this power to the Vice President's office. And again, as you said, there's no constitutional requirement for this. There's nothing in the Constitution that permits this, doesn't forbid it. But the reality is, I think we had a devolution of power on this particular issue. And because the Vice President had all this experience, he accepted it and ran with it.
Never has a man had so much power and authority that wasn't elected president. Thank you, Bob Windrem. Thank you, Mike Isikoff. Your book, Hubris, is out, co-authored by you and David Corn. Up next, Karl Rove gets interviewed by a special prosecutor in the investigation.